What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest stars steps onto a morning show set and decides to break the mold? When perfectly curated questions meet raw, honest answers. When a legendary actor decides he's tired of the same old narrative about his career, choices, and legacy. This morning on Good Morning America, viewers witnessed something they never expected to see: John Travolta. The man who danced his way into our hearts, soared in jets, and serenaded us through decades of cinema, sat down across from George Stephanopoulos. What began as a routine promotional interview quickly turned into one of the most uncomfortable and tension-filled exchanges in morning television history. Before we dive into what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave us a comment below, sharing your thoughts on celebrities pushing back against tough interview questions. Now, let's break down how this interview took an unexpected turn. The interview started off calmly enough. Travolta entered the set with his signature smile, the charm that has captivated audiences for decades. Stephanopoulos greeted him warmly, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed perfectly normal. They discussed Travolta's latest project, a film that marked his return to a style of role fans had been eagerly awaiting for years. The conversation flowed smoothly as Travolta spoke about his preparation for the character, the physical training involved, and his excitement about working with the director. But then, Stephanopoulos shifted gears. He leaned in slightly, his expression growing more serious. He raised the issue that had been buzzing in the industry for months, but had rarely been addressed on camera: the box office disappointments. The string of films that had failed to resonate with audiences the way his past hits had. Critics had suggested that perhaps Travolta's time as a leading man was over. Travolta's smile faded, but not in a dramatic, viral way. There was a shift in his eyes, a hardening. He sat back, the pause long enough to feel uncomfortable before responding. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it now. He pointed out how the conversation always seemed to return to his failures, rather than focusing on his artistic choices, the risks he'd taken, and the stories he'd chosen to tell, regardless of whether they made millions. He reminded Stephanopoulos that he had been in the industry for over 4 decades, experiencing highs and lows that would break most people, yet he was still here, still working, still passionate about his craft. Stephanopoulos, to his credit, didn't back down. He clarified that he wasn't focusing on failure, but wanted to understand how Travolta viewed this phase of his career in the context of his earlier successes. He mentioned iconic roles and cultural milestones like Saturday Night Fever, Grease, and Pulp Fiction, asking whether Travolta felt pressure to recapture that magic. That's when Travolta's demeanor truly shifted. Leaning forward, his voice rising slightly, but still measured, he expressed frustration. He said this was the issue with these types of interviews: the constant comparisons. The idea that unless he was at the height of cultural relevance, he was somehow irrelevant. He directly asked Stephanopoulos if he thought artists should only be valued for their commercial hits, or if there was merit in the journey, the evolution, and the willingness to keep creating even when the spotlight wasn't as bright. Stephanopoulos attempted to clarify, assuring Travolta that he meant no disrespect and had immense admiration for his body of work. But Travolta cut him off, not rudely, but firmly. He mentioned he had heard this kind of response before. The classic retreat after asking a question designed to provoke exactly the defensive reaction it did. He expressed his frustration with the game, where interviewers throw out pointed questions about perceived decline and then act surprised when the subject doesn't just smile and nod along. The studio went silent, with the producers likely wondering if they should cut to commercial or intervene. But both men were professionals, and this was live television. There was nowhere to hide. Stephanopoulos regained his composure and shifted the conversation, asking Travolta about his recent career choices. He pointed out that Travolta had taken roles in smaller independent films instead of pursuing major studio blockbusters. Travolta's response was sharp. He noted that framing his choices as a fallback rather than a conscious decision revealed a bias in the question itself. He didn't see working on meaningful projects with filmmakers he respected, and taking on roles that challenged him as a consolation prize. Instead, he saw it as an intentional choice, reflecting his evolution as an artist, not a sign of decline. Travolta looked directly into the camera, not Stephanopoulos, and asked if the issue was not with actors who evolve and take risks, but with an industry and media culture that only measured success in terms of opening weekend, numbers, and franchise potential. Stephanopoulos was clearly taken aback. He paused to regroup and then tried to steer the conversation toward what he described as a more constructive direction. He brought up Travolta's past openness about personal struggles, loss, grief, and finding his way back to work after tragedy. He asked if those experiences had changed Travolta's relationship with fame and success. That's when the atmosphere in the room truly shifted. Travolta's jaw tightened as he stared at Stephanopoulos for a moment before speaking. His voice dropped low, filled with barely contained frustration, as he said that, bringing up his personal tragedies in the context of box office, numbers, and career trajectory was exactly the kind of exploitation he had spent years trying to avoid. He emphasized that his grief and loss were not just narrative devices to explain why his recent films hadn't performed as expected. Stephanopoulos immediately tried to clarify, saying that was not his intention and that he simply wanted to understand how Travolta's personal experiences shaped his professional journey. But Travolta wasn't buying it. He firmly stated that the full picture of who he was as a person was none of Stephanopoulos' business. Certainly not material for a morning television segment wedged between cooking demonstrations and celebrity gossip. He had agreed to come on the show to talk about his new film, not to be psychoanalyzed and have his personal pain used as a context for his career. The tension in the room was thick. Stephanopoulos shifted in his seat, clearly calculating his next move. After a deep breath, he acknowledged Travolta's frustration but explained that, as a public figure who had previously shared aspects of his personal life, it was natural for journalists to explore how those experiences influenced his work. He stated that it wasn't exploitation, but journalism offering the audience a deeper insight into the artists they admired. Travolta let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. He responded, saying that it was a convenient argument for someone whose job it was to extract sound bites and emotional moments from guests. He pointed out that calling it journalism didn't make it any less intrusive or calculated. He emphasized that Stephanopoulos had not asked him a single substantive question about the film he was there to promote, not about its themes, the director's vision, or his approach to the character. Instead, the focus had been entirely on his perceived failures and personal tragedies. Stephanopoulos countered, reminding Travolta that he had started the interview discussing the film. It was Travolta who had shifted the tone by reacting defensively to questions about his career. He suggested that if Travolta didn't want to engage with questions about his work in the broader context of his career, he should have made that clear to the producers beforehand. Stephanopoulos argued that pushing back on every question and accusing him of exploitation wasn't productive and was preventing a meaningful conversation. Travolta leaned forward again, his voice rising for the first time. He said maybe meaningful conversation wasn't actually what Good Morning America wanted. Maybe they were after exactly what was happening right now: conflict, drama, a moment that would be clipped and shared across social media with headlines about John Travolta losing it or melting down. He added that Stephanopoulos could claim journalistic integrity all he wanted, but they both knew that morning television was about ratings, clicks, and keeping audiences engaged during commercial breaks. Stephanopoulos' expression hardened. He shot back, saying it was unfair for Travolta to question his integrity as a journalist. He had spent decades building a reputation for asking tough questions and holding people accountable. And just because Travolta didn't like the questions didn't mean they weren't valid. He told Travolta that celebrities didn't get to control the narrative completely, and that part of being in the public eye was accepting scrutiny of their work and choices. Travolta immediately fired back, saying there was a difference between scrutiny and condescension, between tough questions and gotcha moments designed to provoke a reaction. He pointed out that Stephanopoulos had come into the interview with a predetermined narrative about his career being in decline, and every question had been crafted to support that, regardless of how Travolta responded. He argued that this wasn't journalism, it was agenda-driven interviewing, and he wasn't going to sit there and pretend otherwise just to be polite. The studio fell silent. This had moved far beyond typical interview tension. Both men, used to being in control, were now locked in a battle of wills. Stephanopoulos paused, clearly weighing whether to escalate or try to de-escalate the situation. He chose to push forward, asking Travolta directly if he believed all criticism of his recent work was unfair, or if he thought journalists and critics had a vendetta against him. He asked if Travolta could acknowledge that some of the concerns about his career choices were legitimate. He said that defensiveness in response to honest questions made it seem like Travolta couldn't accept any perspective that didn't align with his own view of himself and his work. That comment hit differently. You could see it on Travolta's face. This wasn't just about his career trajectory or interview tactics anymore. It had become personal. Travolta leaned back, and for a moment, it seemed like he might actually walk off the set. But instead, he collected himself and spoke with a calm intensity. He explained that the assumption behind that question was that criticism automatically equals truth, that if enough people say something, it must be valid. He had been in the industry long enough to know that criticism often had little to do with the actual quality of work and everything to do with trends, cultural moments, and what critics needed to write to stay relevant. Travolta clarified that he wasn't defensive about honest critique of his performances, but he refused to accept the narrative that just because his recent films hadn't been major commercial hits, he was somehow failing or desperately clinging to relevance. His voice grew stronger as he continued. He said that his career choices prioritized artistic fulfillment over guaranteed paychecks. He had worked with young filmmakers who needed his name to help get their projects funded. He had taken roles that challenged him, pushed him out of his comfort zone, and may not have been safe bets, but felt important to him as an artist. Yes, some of those films didn't connect with wide audiences, and some were critically dismissed, but he was proud of that work. He was proud of taking risks and resented the implication that unless he was starring in $100 million franchise films, he was a cautionary tale of faded glory. Stephanopoulos allowed him to finish before responding, saying no one had called him a cautionary tale. Travolta was putting words in his mouth and creating an argument that wasn't there. He explained that asking an actor to reflect on different phases of their career was standard in interviews, and that Travolta's reaction was disproportionate to the questions being asked. Stephanopoulos suggested that maybe Travolta was projecting his own insecurities onto questions that were intended to be straightforward and professional. The word insecurities hung in the air like a bomb. Travolta's eyes flashed with anger. He responded sharply, saying Stephanopoulos didn't know him well enough to psychoanalyze him on national television. He made it clear that confidence and insecurity had nothing to do with calling out lazy journalism that relied on tired narratives about aging actors and fading star power. If Stephanopoulos wanted to have a real conversation about the film industry, about how it treats artists over 50, how the system churns through talent and discards people once they are no longer considered profitable, then they could have that conversation. But framing legitimate critique of the system as personal insecurity was dismissive and intellectually dishonest. Stephanopoulos replied that they were trying to have that conversation, but Travolta kept deflecting any question that required self-reflection, turning it into an attack on journalism or the industry at large. He said that taking responsibility for one's career choices and acknowledging when things hadn't gone as planned was not the same as admitting failure. It was about maturity, growth, and refusing to engage with that kind of honesty made the conversation feel more like a performance than a substantive exchange. Travolta looked at him incredulously, challenging his notion of honesty and substance. He pointed out that Stephanopoulos had the audacity to talk about those qualities when the entire premise of morning show interviews was based on superficiality. He said these shows brought celebrities on for short segments, asked pre-approved questions, and expected them to smile, be charming, and plug their projects. But the moment someone deviated from that script, pushed back, or challenged the format, they were labeled as difficult or defensive. He called out the hypocrisy, saying it was stunning. Travolta didn't stop there. He said that Stephanopoulos had built his career on being the serious journalist of the morning show circuit, the one with the political background and hard-hitting interview style. But, in the end, he was still doing puff pieces with movie stars, asking the same recycled questions that every other entertainment journalist asked. And when those stars didn't play along, when they refused to feed into the narrative predetermined by producers, suddenly it was about their attitude, not the quality of the questions being asked. Stephanopoulos' professionalism began to crack. His voice took on an edge of frustration as he pointed out that Travolta had agreed to come on Good Morning America voluntarily. No one had forced him to do the interview. If he had such contempt for the format and the questions, he should have declined the invitation. Stephanopoulos said that sitting there insulting the show and him personally, acting as though Travolta was being victimized by basic interview questions, was absurd. He argued that plenty of actors, including many of Travolta's peers, had come on the show and managed to have thoughtful, engaging conversations without turning the interview into a confrontation. Travolta smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. He responded that maybe those actors were better at playing the game than he was. Maybe they were more willing to swallow their pride and pretend everything was fine, that every career choice had been perfect. But they had no frustrations with how the industry or the media treated them. He said he had reached a point in his life where he wasn't interested in playing that game anymore. He had nothing left to prove. He didn't need Good Morning America or any other platform to validate his career. He was there because his team thought it would benefit the film, but clearly that had been a miscalculation. Stephanopoulos took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. He said that while he appreciated Travolta's honesty, there was a way to express dissatisfaction with interview questions without being disrespectful to the host or the show. He reminded Travolta that they had given him a platform with millions of people watching, and that the tone of the conversation had turned unnecessarily hostile. He suggested they reset and try to finish the interview on a more positive note, perhaps by discussing the film in more depth. But Travolta wasn't interested in resetting. He said the suggestion itself was revealing this idea that they should just smooth things over, wrap it up neatly, and pretend the last several minutes hadn't happened. He pointed out that this was exactly what was wrong with these formats. Everything had to be packaged and sanitized to be palatable for viewers, who might be uncomfortable with genuine conflict or honest disagreement. Real conversations, he argued, were messy. They involved tension, pushback, and moments where people didn't agree. He said that Stephanopoulos, wanting to fast-forward past all that to some artificial conclusion where they shook hands and smiled, proved his point about the superficiality of the entire setup. Stephanopoulos responded, stating there was a difference between genuine conversation and grandstanding. He said Travolta had already made his points, expressed his frustrations with the industry and media, and questioned his integrity as a journalist. He asked what more Travolta wanted from the interview. Did he want an apology for asking about his career? Did he want Stephanopoulos to admit every question had been inappropriate? He suggested that if Travolta's goal was to portray himself as a victim of unfair media treatment, he was succeeding. But he wasn't sure that was the impression Travolta actually wanted to leave with viewers. Travolta shook his head. He said that he didn't want to be seen as a victim. What he wanted was to be seen as someone willing to call out practices that had become so normalized that people no longer recognize them as problematic. He explained that the celebrity interview industry was built on a power dynamic where the interviewer controlled the narrative, and the subject was expected to be grateful for the exposure. When that dynamic was challenged, when someone refused to play along, the response was always to pathologize their reaction instead of examining the system itself. Travolta continued, saying he knew how this interview would be covered. He knew clips would circulate with headlines about him having a meltdown or being difficult. The narrative, he predicted, would focus on his behavior rather than the substance of what he was saying. And that was fine. He had been in the business long enough to understand how the game worked. But at least he would know he had been honest. At least he would know that he hadn't just smiled and nodded and played along with questions that felt designed to diminish him. Stephanopoulos, now visibly frustrated, asked if, after all they had discussed, Travolta truly believed his questions had been asked in bad faith. Did Travolta really think the goal was to diminish him rather than to have a substantive conversation about his career and work? He said that if Travolta believed that, there was probably no point in continuing, as they were operating from completely different understandings of what had transpired. Travolta paused for the first time since the confrontation began. It seemed like he was actually considering Stephanopoulos' perspective rather than just reacting to it. He said that he didn't believe Stephanopoulos personally had malicious intent. In fact, he thought Stephanopoulos probably believed he was asking fair, reasonable questions. But that was part of the problem. The questions had become so standard, so predictable, that no one questioned whether they should even be asked in the first place. The focus on box office numbers, comparisons to past glory, and the psychologizing of personal tragedy had all just become accepted as normal in celebrity interviews. And maybe it was normal, he admitted. But that didn't make it right. Travolta explained that his frustration wasn't with Stephanopoulos as a person, but with what he represented, the system that grinds down artists, reducing decades of work to sound bites and narratives about peaks and valleys. He pointed out that every actor over a certain age faced these same questions. Are they still relevant? Can they still open a movie? Have they accepted their diminished place in the industry? And those questions took a toll. They shaped how audiences perceived them, becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. If enough people said an actor was past their prime, it eventually became accepted as fact, no matter the actual quality of their work. Stephanopoulos listened carefully. And when Travolta finished, he acknowledged that there was some truth to what Travolta had said. He agreed that the media often created oversimplified narratives about complex careers. He admitted that focusing on commercial success over artistic merit was a real issue in entertainment journalism.